Hey folks, I hope everyone is doing really well. Today, let's talk about soup tasting. It sounds strange, but it was actually something I learned at Blizzard, and I hope that it can really help you with your development process as well. One of the biggest challenges I've found about game development is getting people to play the game. And with more complicated games, especially games which contain a lot of systems that might interact with each other. By systems, I mean things like a procedural generation system, or maybe, the follower system from World of Warcraft. These systems, the more that they interact with each other, the more important it actually is for people to play the game, because so much of that feedback or that experiential component, which is what players are going to see when the game first comes out, can only really be discovered by people sitting down and actually just playing the game for a long time. Now, this is different to what QA might do. QA, their job is to sit down and play, yes, but dominantly their focus is much more on a very specific part of the game, and they're probably trying to break it. So for example, let's say you're making a game like Hades. Hades has a lot of different systems, but a QA person on, say, Hades is probably more looking to break or to see if one very specific part of the game works, as opposed to the whole picture. Like, how does the game feel as a player sitting down and playing it at day zero? And how does it feel? And how do all those systems interact with each other? On World of Warcraft, this is actually amplified, because it's not just the early game experience. If you're working on an expansion, say day one of an expansion launch, everyone's in the game and they're playing and they're all having a great time. That part of it is relatively easy to test. And in fact, during development, the early story and early questing experience probably gets a lot of testing anyway, because that's where most people, when they sit down to play it, they'll just start a new character. The harder part of testing a game like World of Warcraft is actually functionally and effectively testing the endgame experience. The endgame experience is something that only happens after someone's been playing for a while, maybe a week or two if you were lucky. The game, once launch comes out, and then they're playing it. And that's when you start to see how the major systems really start to work together. Because so many of the systems for World of Warcraft are designed to really kick in at the end game. Yes, there's some unlocking of the systems as you progress through the expansion content, but the reality is most of it's designed for the end game in order to keep players playing for a long period of time. And that's why it's really hard to test, because you can't just have everyone on your team sort of stop for a while and sit down, create a new character, level up and play unless the game is live. Or can you? And this is where soup tasting comes in. So soup tasting was something that some really smart people, not me, but some really smart people in the production or the design or somewhere came up with, where we would basically say pens down about 3 months before we actually released the game. The team would then be told, play the game, create a new character. They'd be able to use their existing characters on live. Pretty much everyone had one, copy them over to an internal server that would stay live and that would basically act as if the game was live and that we launched the experience. And then everyone on the team would sit there and play. And they'd play every day. This, mostly it was the design team that did it, but we also had like a couple of really enthusiastic engineers and artists who were also leaning in on this. And the whole team would stop and they'd play the game for a while. They'd level up, they'd get to the end game, and we'd all be playing the end game experience. We'd all be seeing and experiencing it. This really helped with adventure mode early on, like when we were figuring that out, because it allowed us to see what the experience would be like for the players once they got to this end game experience way in advance of them actually getting there. It kind of forced the entire team to play the game for a period of time. There were a lot of changes that actually came from testing the game in this way. We revamped a lot of different things, and it wasn't like we were able to completely rebuild everything. I mean, we had a certain number of months in order to rebuild things, But it did allow us to identify core issues with, say, timing on things, or how, when a system unlocked, we could change that really easily, or the way that, loot was distributed based on adventure mode. There were actually, there were some pretty substantial things that got changed during development because of the feedback that we found from soup tasting. Of course, the name comes from you're tasting the soup before you, if you've ever worked as a chef or anything like that, or a cook, or as a waiter, you probably know that typically before you serve a meal to someone at a restaurant, it's always important for the cook or the chef or whoever to actually taste it before it goes out to ensure that what they're giving the customer is good. Same concept here, as opposed to just releasing the expansion and then hoping that everything works. It's important for the development team to actually sit down and spend a decent chunk of time playing the game before it goes out to the audience. Now, early access kind of serves this in some ways. The challenge is that you're actually also giving access to your audience. So you're not really tasting the soup. So as the chef before the customer tastes it, it's more like you're tasting it, like you're going and eating the meal with the customer at the same time. And that's what early access does. But we found this really valuable because it gave us, again, the opportunity to sit down, play the game, and make changes in an environment where we didn't have the pressure or the onlooking, pressure really of the community looking at whatever systems we were building and giving us feedback. It was much more our own perspective. And really, that's the developers of the game should be the most informed, and they're probably the best. The ones who are most likely to be able to provide the best answers to concerns or questions that pop up. We're also the most likely to be able to see the problems as they arrive. Now, when you're on a team as large as this, there's so many different people working on all these different systems all at the same time. It's a good chance that someone who built out the adventure mode system didn't also have a chance to play through every single quest in the game and unlock everything. So, or maybe there was like a small area of the the cooking system or something that unlocked, that someone who was working on a different part of the crafting system or someone who was doing the class design didn't know that existed until they had a chance to sit down and play it. That's the problem with games that are so big like this, is that there can be so many things that are overlapping in this way that testing them and actually seeing them from an experiential perspective, not just a quality assurance perspective or a customer service perspective, but from an actual, how is the audience going to experience this? That is probably the hardest part about game development, in my perspective, especially game development on these much larger projects like this. I think if you're building a smaller game, much smaller, Dig a Hole in the Backyard, which just came out, which looks fantastic. But then that's easier to test, right? That is a single linear experience. It doesn't have that many systems in place, and it's fairly straightforward to test that and gain that experience. But for something as large as this, or even as big as Hades, Hades is something which, yes, they were in early access for a long time. But even when it first launched into early access, Hades was already a very polished experience. It was clear that that team had been playing it for quite a while. And then what they were doing is, as it was in early access, they were layering and dramatically modifying, in some cases, many aspects of that game. So yes, they were doing that iteration and testing while it was in early access, but it's pretty clear that they had a strong understanding what the game was like before it even got to that point. Because when it did launch, it was already a pretty tight, cohesive experience that already tasted the soup. Anyway, takeaway here is my big advice for you, if you are doing any kind of development, is carve out a decent chunk of time at the end of development before you plan to launch it. We were 3 months out at least. We would sort of go pens down and start playing. That would give us the time to actually play it for a while and then react and make changes based on that play testing feedback. And then also change and then test out those changes before we had to go live. I suggest you try and do the same thing. Try and find and carve out a period of time for your team to put pens down and make this sacrosanct, make this something which is very important for the team to do. It's very tempting for people who, like us, who like to build things, to continue to build something, even though, the majority of the team is testing something. It's really important for people to stop and play the game. Now you could probably, chunk this out and do it on a more regular basis, but I don't think that that gets you as holistic an experience as like, okay, we're locking everything on this date and then we're spending a few months just playing the experience. Then we can make changes based on the feedback of us playing it. That was the most valuable part, was actually getting pens down, focused on something that had all come together, that wasn't just piecemeal, or there wasn't a piece missing, or like there wasn't a gigantic zone or something that wasn't finished that you just had to like imagine was there. It was pretty much, it was done. There were some things that were still coming in that we knew were polished, but it was pretty much in a state where we were like, yeah, okay, we could probably launch this. Okay, now let's start testing it. And now let's start iterating based on that. So I hope this was valuable. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you again tomorrow.